Well, it's not good morning anymore, it's afternoon, but a very, very warm welcome to everyone here in the room and online. This is actually the first time we have a live event. The break's been way too long. I think it's been 2.5, 3-ish years or something. I've actually gotten grey hairs in between, which isn't nice, so that also shows that the break was quite long. Technical thing, I would ask everyone to turn their mics off at home and turn phones off and so on, so we don't have a lot of different sounds here. Anyway, this is also the first time we've met with my Nordic colleagues in a while. And today we're going to take two different views on global mobility. So we're going to start off at looking at the Nordics and what happens here, what to think about. Asking ourselves the question, do we actually have a one Nordic labour market? Then we're going to move on to a more global perspective, being joined by a panel and Lennart in about 45 minutes. So this is what the timetable looks like for today. So in the second part, we're going to have a panel consisting of Lego Group, Volvo Cars and International SOS, commenting on their views on business travel before and after COVID. So I'm really looking forward to that. But as a starting point, we start with the one Nordic labour market. And I'm joined here, it's not Snow White and the 7 dwarfs, it's Snow White and the 4 dwarfs today. But I've got here some of my colleagues that we've been working with for about 20 years, some a little bit shorter. We've got Fredrik from Denmark, actually really living in Sweden though, but still officially working in Denmark. Got Håkan from Norway, Timo, who I've seen more than enough of here during the past 3 years within the office. So Timo joining from our Helsinki office, and Vladimir from Sweden. And we're going to take you through the Nordic labour market. Is it or is it not? But I'll turn it over to you, Fredrik, to say a few words before we start.
Thank you, Paula, and thank you for that introduction. And thank you all for joining this session. I must say it's a bit awkward to be in real life. It's been a long time. I just got used to look in the small camera on the top of my laptop. So all of you on the stream, thank you for making me feel at home. As a Swede, grown up in the northern part of Sweden, I must start with paying due respect to Finland. Big congratulations on the gold medal in the ice hockey championship. Really good. Even though it was clearly home referees, I think. The topic for today is, do we have one Nordic labour market? And Paula, you didn't need the Marcus people to sell that one in one, right? It sells itself, yeah. And I think most of you in this room know the answer to that question, but just to demonstrate it with an example from last week when I had a Danish client who had an employee living in Sweden. The employee performed part of his duties in the office in Copenhagen, part of the duties in Malmö, Sweden, but had also responsibilities in Norway in a group company. And the conclusion was that the Danish employer had to register as an employer in Sweden, Denmark and Norway and do monthly withholding and reporting in each 3 countries. So I think that clearly demonstrates that it's not a one Nordic labour market. But it is light in the end of the tunnel. The Nordic Council has this vision that the Nordic should be the most integrated labour market in the world by 2030. And with an integrated labour market, then of course tax and social security is decisive for its success. And a good part here is that we actually in KPMG got the assignment to assist with fulfilling that vision by doing a white paper on the obstacles, but also the potential solutions in order to achieve a integrated labour market. So one ask for us to you here today is that please share your obstacles and potential war stories, because one of the ideas is actually to, in an appendix to this report, pinpoint with real examples that really demonstrates how stupid it is, how it's a really lose-lose situation that we can't be more integrated in the Nordics. I lost my mic here. Cautious of time, and we have a lot on our minds. So, Paula, I think we should kick off and start to look at the obstacles and opportunities with cross-border work.
I mean, for the ones of you active within the Nordics, these would probably be quite common to you. So obviously, there's different types of legislations and rules in all countries. So even if we're all looking at having the economic employer quite soon, it's all kind of implemented differently. So different types of registrations. Obviously, I mean, an obstacle is such as you need to keep in mind a lot of different rules. There's a whole admin around tracking people, the admin for the employee, which might sometimes become a bit burdensome. I had a Swede coming to Finland by mistake registering him permanently in Finland, which led to his teenage daughters being cut off their phones, which wasn't a good thing. So again, not a tax obstacle, but certainly one. Trek treaty, some of you know it, some of you don't. It doesn't maybe work ideally, should work ideally. Remote work, an opportunity at the same time, but still obviously a little bit of a challenge when you look to arrange it correctly. Different labor law rules in different countries. But again, then, yes, there are some possibilities and good things as well. We've got the exemption within the Nordic countries, so you can potentially have much lower tax rates working in two countries. War for talent might be easier if you don't force a Swede to move to Finland in November, if you let them work at home. Better use of cross-border talent, if it would be easier to work and move across borders. And actually, I mean, more connectivity between different companies and teams. So there's a lot of things to bear in mind. But for us to better be able to look at these different options where we have the economic employer rules and remote work, I'll hand it over to Fredrik, who now I think has a functioning mic again, to talk us over the different types of cross-border works.
Thank you. And there are many ways of defining cross-border works, and there's no right or wrong. But for the purpose of this session, we have used these categories. The first one is the traditional commuter. People like me commute from Malmö to Copenhagen on a daily basis. This group is not in focus today because they are usually not that complex. But bear in mind that it could be different cross-border regulations that you need to take into consideration. The second one, which is in scope, is the business travelers. And business travelers in that sense that it's not a business travel when you leave for your home country company going on a conference or anything like that. But it is actually when you go to another country, another Nordic country, to perform something that makes a benefit that will entail maybe an invoice or a cost allocation to that country. It could, for example, be if you work in a matrix organization where you have different responsibilities in all the different Nordic countries. Or it could be in a functional organization where you actually have one hub in one country and you take in people from the other Nordic countries to that. So that is in scope, and then we usually talk about the economic employer approach. And the last one that you all know have exploded during COVID, hopefully we can say post-COVID, that is remote work when we work from home. But let's start with so we have these two actually overall purposes. The one is to look at the economic employer approach. The second one is to look at remote work, when you can get an obligation either in the host country due to economic employer or an obligation in the employee's home country due to remote work from home. And Vladi, you are the new kid on the block when it comes to economic employer approach. You had the regulation for over a year now, so what is the status?
Yeah, I'm sure Norway and Denmark are kind of tired of hearing of the economic employer concept. I think a lot of Swedish people are now too. But we
Finland will soon be.
Yep. So we're the new kid on the block for now, but hopefully not for long. Well, depends on how you would like to see it. But let's just very briefly go over what is actually the economic employer. So just a super quick example. Legal employer, simple. It's wherever you have your contract. The company that you have your contract with is your legal employer. For me, KPMG Sweden. Economic employer then, what's that? It's basically the company that is the beneficiary of your work. So again, very simple example. Let's say that Paula has a client in Finland that needs assistance regarding Swedish taxation. She calls me, says, Vladi, I need you here for a project for 3 months. I need help with a client here. I come over. KPMG Finland is the one that bills. They're the one that are the beneficiary of my work. They're the ones that basically get the monetary value of my work. Therefore, I have my economic employer in Finland in that case. The OECD does have, which helps us out, has some triggers which can help us determine and make the assessment of when you have your economic employer. You have a couple of examples there. Which entity has authority to instruct the employee on how everyday work should be performed? Which entity disposes and has control of the place of work? Is the cost recharged? Which entity provides work tools and is able to make the employee perform the work? Which entity decides how many employees there should be there and what kind of qualifications they should have? Which entity has the right to pick which employees to work on what task? Which entity has a right to impose disciplinary actions? And which entity decides on vacation and work schedule? These are indicators. These should help you assess if you have your economic employer. Some of them we've seen historically from other countries, and I'm sure you guys have more experience on this than we do from Swedish perspective right now, are more decisive or more heavy indicators of maybe having your economic employer. A classic one being the work being recharged back to the home entity is a very classic one, which you would say is a heavy indicator for a person having their economic employer there. But in Sweden right now, we haven't come to that conclusion yet, so it's still a very balanced, you do an overall assessment of all these triggers. Go to the next slide. So, Nordic rules, I mean, obviously the topic is one Nordic. Where do we differ? Obviously, Sweden just implemented this roughly a year and a half ago. It is new. We've obviously taken some inspiration from our neighbors in both Denmark and Norway, but we did decide to do some things differently, which isn't very popular always.
Oh, and as popular it is, it seems like the Finnish government is copying it.
Yeah, well, again, you take inspiration from your neighbors. One of the things that Sweden has done that's a little bit different from at least Denmark is the full obligation lays on the foreign entity, which means if Timo, for instance, is sent from Finland to Sweden and he's decided that he has his economic employer in Sweden, the Swedish entity doesn't have to do anything. There's no responsibility or no obligations for the Swedish entity. All responsibility and obligation falls on the Finnish entity. So the Finnish entity would have to register in Sweden. They have to pay taxes, well, withhold and pay taxes in Sweden, based on his physical presence and physical working days in Sweden. The biggest difference, however, is that Sweden implemented is what's been very commonly known as the 15 and 45-day rule. So if a person is in Sweden for less than 15 working days in a row, or 45 days total over a calendar year, no assessment of economic employer needs to be made. This is very different from our neighbors. So basically, if you have a person that's in Sweden for 14 working days in a row, you don't even have to assess economic employer. They're fine, they're safe. It's basically a safe period. So you can stay in the country for a couple of meetings or do some things where you don't have to assess the economic employer. Also, what's good about, which actually is simplified, is that if the person is taxable, they're taxed at a flat tax rate of 25%, which commonly known in Sweden is SINK tax. We mentioned that we've had it for a year and a half, roughly. So what's happened? What have we learned? What do we know so far? Obviously, this is new for us. This is new for our clients, but it's also new for the Swedish tax authorities. And bless them, they're doing their best as well to try to find pragmatic solutions sometimes, not always, but they're doing their best. One of them that we've noticed a lot when the region where me and Frederick, I'm situated in the Malmö office, I live in Sweden, but there's obviously a lot of traffic between Copenhagen and Malmö and the Öresund region, is that if you can present a withholding decision, basically saying that the person won't be taxable based on the Öresund rules, we're not going to go into detail of what that is today, but if they have a withholding decision from the Swedish tax authority saying that, well, your income will be exempt based on those rules, the foreign entity does not have to register, which has been a really pragmatic approach, and we're really pleased because it would be so administratively heavy. It would be a heavy burden. So far, we haven't seen, unlike other countries, some indicators or some triggers being more decisive for the economic employer than any others. So as far as we know, just because you're recharging the cost doesn't mean that the person necessarily has the economic employer. Could still be, but doesn't necessarily have to be it. It's still, you still have to look at all the triggers, a full range of what the work is and what kind of work they're doing to be able to assess economic employer. Frederick, what does it look like in Denmark?
I think you pinpointed the main difference between Sweden and Denmark, and that is actually that it's the receiving company in Denmark that gets the withholding and reporting obligation, which says there it's a flat rate of 35.6. You can opt to use the ordinary tax rates and brackets. Since 35.6 could be quite high depending on what kind of personnel you are sending across the borders.
Well, you're winning the tax rate competition here.
Oh, I'm happy.
Yeah, you win something.
Denmark wins a lot.
Suddenly you're Danish?
Only when it comes to football.
Yeah.
Really?
From a Norwegian point of view, we had this economic employer since the mid-70s, when Stavanger at the west coast of Norway were filled with Americans not paying any taxes to Norway. They were out finding oil in the Norwegian Sea. So I had to find a way to tax these individuals and get some thresholds back to Norway. And since then we had the economic employer approach. We do not have a 1545-day rule. You become tax liable from day one, which is very similar to Denmark. What is not very similar to Denmark is that most of the reporting and registration obligations are with the foreign company, meaning the company that actually sends the employee to Norway. So a little bit different there. When it comes to tax rates, there are two ways of taxing foreign individuals in Norway. One is using the ordinary tax system, but we also have a pay-as-you-earn system where we have flat tax rates, which are either 25% if you are a member of Norwegian Social Security or 17% if you are not a member of Norwegian Social Security.
Yeah, and maybe to recap the situation with Finland. So, as mentioned, the new law is planned to be implemented into use beginning of next year. It was supposed to come already beginning of this year, but the process was delayed, and there's been some updates on the government's proposal on the rules, and main thing being that there has now been added this threshold 15 and 45 days, so 15 at one go and 45 days per calendar year, which is obviously copied from Sweden. I think it would be easier to have only one threshold instead of two, as it leaves some room for interpretation and so forth. But nevertheless, that's the case, and in Finland, those thresholds actually, as per the current proposal, apply only to the situation when it's a group of companies. So, for example, parent company and subsidiary in Finland. And also, I think, unlike our Nordic colleagues, there's an obligations for both parties. So, for the former employer, reporting obligations and possibly withholding obligation if there's a permanent establishment in Finland. And then for the economic employer in Finland, there's a notification requirement, which is the same as in the situation with the foreign leased employees. And then, obviously, for the employee, there's a obligation to apply for the tax at source payments, or if there's a withholding obligation, then tax card to be applied. So, again, a bit different than with the Nordic countries, but I think it would be easier if all the obligations would be on either on the former employer or on the economic employer, not on both. But it is what it is currently, and let's see. Future will tell how it will look like then, and how it will. I'm sure there'll be a lot of situation when there's a lot of unclear and room for interpretation, and until there's some court cases and more practice. So let's see.
And I actually think that's a good point in relation. We have the same Nordic double taxation treaty, all countries, but we can really administrate differently in each country, and that's one wish.
Yeah, and I think there's one thing kind of wrapping up around the economic employer rules, that how you define an economic employer, that's pretty much the same in all countries. But then the 50 and 45-day rules, potentially that's only going to be the same in 2 countries. We all have different reporting rules. So obviously this is, Fredrik, I guess, a wish that we will put forward, and that's just to simplify. That would be easier, because it's doable, of course, to do it like this, but it just requires to keep more different rules and registrations in place. But I think we're going to be moving on to the next topic, which next to the economic employer has been a little bit of a hot topic with the past years, and that's around remote work. So even if, yes, we will probably have in the future people traveling between countries, causing economic employers in different Nordic countries, and why not outside of the Nordics, but I think it might become just as common around the remote work. So Fredrik might not want to drive over to Copenhagen every day.
Exactly.
Might want to stay in Stockholm. No, sorry, in Sweden. And what does that mean? But I guess, Timo, it's your show for the next 5-ish minutes or so.
Thank you. Yeah. So remote work, and by remote work, we mean here basically that employee working from another country than where his or her employer is located. So foreign remote work. What we have seen in Finland, the current trend is that mostly companies are interested on this topic because employees want to work remotely. Obviously, this relates to COVID in many cases because people have been working from home office for a long time, and now they have figured out that why couldn't I work from some other country, for example, combining with the vacation, or if there's a holiday home or family living in another country. So that has been, at least in Finland, sort of the main driver behind this. Obviously, companies see this as an opportunity for employer branding, for attracting more talent, and also increasing job satisfaction, so that for some employees this can be a really meaningful thing, especially if there's like family living outside of, for example, Finland. And therefore, since there's a lot of these remote work requests on companies' table, there is a demand for creating a systematic process and approach how to handle these requests, and in which situations they can allow it, and so forth. And what we have seen in Finland currently, what the companies have done, some are considering implementing remote work policy, some kind of policy or framework around this into use. Some companies already have it. Then some companies are doing this sort of case by case. So if there's a new request on the table, they just look at it, and there's no sort of transparent, aligned way to handle that. And then some have some shortlisted countries. Perhaps they have made some sort of assessment that those are not very risky ones, and they allow it under certain circumstances working from those countries. And then there's still one of those that are categorically declining or forbidding foreign remote work. Then obviously companies are considering some restrictions or limitations around this remote work in terms of, for example, the duration, how long employee can work from another country, and then also the countries. I think in most cases, many companies, they limit acceptable countries to EU area, which sort of you can tackle quite many obstacles with that in terms of, for example, work permits if it's an EU citizen, social security, applying A1 certificate, and so forth. Then there also might be some limitations regarding the tasks that can be done from the foreign country or positions. This relates mostly to permanent establishment risks that might be there, which we will talk about a bit later on more. And the main objective for many companies is that they will allow it, but they want to make sure that they avoid creating permanent establishment in the another country, and also try to make it so that there's no additional obligations created in the other countries. So those are sort of the main objectives. Then shortly, if we look at the examples, what things companies should consider when creating this, for example, policy, is obviously tax obligations for the company, permanent establishment risk. Then for obviously for the employee, if employee would become taxable in another country, for example due to PE or economic employer or spending too much time there. Social Security, can A1 certificate be applied, or can there be some Social Security obligations in the remote work country, reporting obligations for the employer, immigration, especially if we go outside EU. In many cases, the productive work requires a work permit, which is obviously one challenge, additional challenge, because usually it requires have some sort of local employer sponsoring the permit and so forth. Then, in some cases, posted worker notification could come into play, data security, how to make sure that the data is secured, and the labor law considerations. So these are the ones that should be considered, and they should be put into the policy in order to mitigate the risks and find a good balance between keeping the employees satisfied and also making sure that there's no sort of risk that can be avoided with the good planning.
Yep, thanks. I think before we move over to the next around permanent establishment, that was a little bit inspired by Sweden's recent announcement. Maybe just a quick round of if you have a remote worker in your country, say a Finnish employer with a remote worker in your country, just quickly what obligations would arise in your countries?
From a Danish point of view, we look if there is a permanent establishment, and if
let's
then if
pretend that there isn't.
Then there's no employer obligations in relation to tax, withholding, or reporting.
Okay, I guess assuming that we have an A1 in place.
Yes.
Yeah.
If you have a remote worker sitting in Norway, then you have to register.
You have to do RF?
No.
No RF.
No RF, you have to register in the employee register, and you have to do withholdings and salary reporting.
How about Sweden?
Similar to Norway. If you have a remote worker in Sweden, the employer has to register, they have to withhold and pay taxes.
All right, so then the solution is remote work in Denmark, drinking beer. Okay, cool. All right, so not to be or not to be, but PE or not to PE, this is a very, very good joke.
Is this a question?
Yes, I believe you promised to answer that question and lead us through what's the deal with remote work and permanent establishment.
Thank you. We now looked at some obstacles when companies have employees placed around in the different Nordic countries, and we specifically looked at whether or not the employee will become tax liable to one or more countries. The PE spørsmål, or the question about the permanent establishment, is a question of whether or not the foreign corporation becomes tax liable to the state where they actually have an employee sitting. So the starting point, of course, is that a corporation is tax liable in the country where the corporation is situated. So the permanent establishment question is a question of what must be fulfilled in order for the other state to actually be able to tax some of the income from that corporation. And this is a tax treaty concept, which is the tax treaty saying that if these situations appear, then you have the right to tax. And basically what the treaty says is that if a Finnish corporation, for example, has a fixed place of business in Norway, in which they perform their business, then Norway has the right to tax the income, which can be allocated to that fixed place of business in Norway. And the question is then, what does it take to have a fixed place of business? And you need one place, you need an office, of course, or a building site or something. And then you look at the duration, which is normally 6 months or 12 months, and then you have to check whether or not they're actually doing something that can be labeled as business. And in this relation, we should specifically look at the home office situation. And as we all know, during the pandemic, certainly many companies found themselves having employees around in the different Nordic countries, especially in Norway, where we weren't allowed to travel in and out of Norway. So meaning that we had a lot of Norwegian companies having people working from home offices, especially in Sweden. And also the other way around, that Finnish, Swedish and Danish companies had Norwegians sitting in Norway, working from a home office in Norway. And the question was, okay, now suddenly we have foreign companies with employees placed in Norway. Does that lead to a permanent establishment? And normally the Norwegian answer to that would be, if not yes, certainly a high risk that it would be a permanent establishment. So during the 2 years of COVID, we got a change in the legislation in Norway saying that if the work ordinarily were to be performed outside Norway, in Finland or Sweden or Denmark, then it would not lead to a PE that the employee actually were placed in Norway, sitting in Norway and working during 2020 and 2021. But as you all know, we are now in 2022 and these rules do no longer apply. So what has happened in Norway after that? Well, we had a case in the tax appeal court where they actually said that, to do a long story a little bit short, a company with one guy working at a home office where he by himself had a wish to work in that home office, they said that, okay, this would lead to a permanent establishment in Norway. A few weeks later, the Norwegian tax authorities wrote an article about home offices and permanent establishments, saying that even though it's stated in the guidelines in the OECD, the Norwegian tax authorities have decided they will not look upon whether or not the home office is initiated by the employee himself or it is the wish of the employer that he works at the home office. So having a guy sitting at a home office working on his PC will, from a Norwegian point of view, lead to a permanent establishment in Norway, providing that all the other conditions, of course, are fulfilled. And I think this is a special Norwegian approach to these rules.
It sounds like a very Norwegian approach.
Very Norwegian approach. So we are front runners on taxing foreign companies.
Yes, yes,
but I know Sweden, Vladi, you have a different approach.
Yes. So up until middle of last month, we had a specific set of guidelines which were a little bit more, well, not as maybe aggressive or offensive as you would like to say it as the Norwegians, but it was a little bit, it was more than the ones that we just received. So what Sweden did, the Swedish tax authorities came out with a new guideline last month where after COVID and seeing that a lot of people are working more from home now, decided to change their guidelines. The old one was from 2015. OECD changed their comments back in 2017 to Article 5, which is the article that talks about permanent establishments, to be more in line with OECD's comments regarding permanent establishment. So that's the Swedish tax authorities are more in line with what OECD comments. What we try to do in Sweden all the time is we try to be somewhere in between, not to upset anybody. So from an economic employer perspective, we were closer to Norway with registering the foreign company. Now we're a little bit closer to Denmark, so we're still friends with everybody. So basically what that means is that working from home, unlike Norway, is not going to necessarily trigger a PE. It really depends on the situation, and it's an individual assessment at each time, and it depends a lot, again, just like Håkon mentioned, is this more the employee that would like to work from home, and is this a solution for them to be happy, or is it more that the company wants them to work? Does the company have an interest in the person working from home? Obviously, just like Håkon mentioned, there's always some factors that always need to be fulfilled, one of them being that this should be going on for at least 6 months. But in the comments from the Swedish tax authorities, they're assuming that this has been going on for 6 months, so they're doing an assessment from that perspective. So a little bit more lenient from the Swedish tax authorities. What about Denmark?
Denmark has great, interesting news, actually, I think, interesting development through the last past years. But Håkon, I must start with complimenting you. That's the first time you say you would cut the long story short and actually do it.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I need to remind you to cut your stories as well.
I'm working on improving myself all the time.
In Denmark, we have this institute with binding advance rulings where you actually can get upfront a decision from the authorities whether or not the tax act will include the taxation, meaning that you can also ask on permanent establishment. Will our activity in Denmark constitute a permanent establishment? And for this session, I went through the rulings in 2021, and there were 21 rulings on permanent establishment. Of these 21 rulings, 16 was on home PEs. So, and that's massive for being that area of expertise in the tax. So it really has the attention. It's booming, and I think these latest rulings, combined with what we call the Corona directive that came 2020, we have actually quite a relaxed approach on permanent establishment. There are still different aspects that you need to take into consideration, but if you try to have some golden rule on this, that is that if it is the company that has a commercial interest of being in Denmark, then it will constitute a permanent establishment. But if it is because the employee wants her or himself due to personal reasons, then most likely not a PE. So it's really interesting and going in the right direction in Denmark.
Yeah, from Finnish perspective, as mentioned, there's the main principles of PE, and there's not really clear exceptions for the remote work. So it is possible that the home office work could create a permanent establishment. You need to look at the case by case assessment, and obviously we need to look at how permanent the working is. Mainly the 6 months is sort of a threshold, that if it's less than 6 months, I think typically it would not create a PE, but if more than that, then what sort of work is done? If it's auxiliary or this preparatory type of work, it most probably would not create a PE. But if it's really important work for the value chain of the company, if the employee, for example, has right to sign agreements and represent the company and so forth, so that obviously increases the risk of having a PE. And then if there's if the company, for example, has sort of if there's no office space secured for the employee in the home office, that it's assumption that he or she works, from constantly from the home office. So that's also one factor to be taken into consideration. So it's the short answer is that perhaps there can be a yes or no, maybe.
So maybe this is the point where we would look to Sweden to copy and not copy the 1545-day rules.
Yeah.
I believe that might be smart, but then maybe moving on to the last topic around this one Nordic labor market and things to consider. We've looked at the economic employer and what's happening with that. We've looked at the remote work, but then the last question maybe is around the social security and remote work.
Yes, and the question is, when you have an employee working from another country than where the employer is situated, is where does that individual become a member of the social security? There are two examples on the board. One is an employee hired by a Finnish company, and the employee, believe it or not, wants to work from Norway for the Finnish employee.
They didn't get the memo.
Yeah. And the question would be, that employee, will he or she be a member of Norwegian or Finnish social security? For a question. And from a Norwegian point of view, he will be a member of Norwegian social security. He will not be regarded as a posted worker, but he will be a multi-state worker. Yeah.
And here again, I think we're different in as Finland accepts these as posted workers, so they would probably issue an A1.
Yeah. So if then Finland is his home for social security issues, then he will get an A1 from Finland. But if Norway is his home for social security issues, he will not get one.
In Denmark, the competent authorities say that it is possible to use the posting regulation, but it is a concrete assessment. Meaning that if, for example, if you are from Germany and move to Germany to work for a Danish entity, then they will maybe have some other glasses on.
So I guess just again to remind that there's obviously also the social securities to look at. So whichever way we look at this, yes, there are a lot of different rules which are very, very different, except for the economic employer we're all looking at having soon, although with different admins. But then, I mean, suggestions, these suggestions here aren't really maybe something that's yet gonna happen tomorrow, but go around our thoughts on what would make it easier. So if the TREC-avtal, which some of you know, the treaty on transferring tax would actually work smoothly as it should, that would naturally make it easier. Personal identification numbers, Håkan, maybe you want to comment on that. That's something that might be a reality soon.
Yes, just comment on that, and that is that the Nordic Council, they have decided that personal identification numbers within Scandinavia, at least, should be accepted by the other country, meaning that a Swede should be able to get a Norwegian tax card using his Swedish personal number, not having to apply for a Norwegian personal number. This is, as far as I know, it's been decided, but it has not been effectuated.
Okay.
So they're actually, this is something that can be done. These are low-hanging fruits, which they can, if there are political will, they can just say, please start on this.
And then I guess, you know, this is more on the wish list type. If the reportings that we've gone through, whether it be remote work or economic employer, if they could all be done just to the home country, that would then forward the information. I think it would make a lot of people's lives easier and give less headaches. Again, as Fredrik mentioned when he opened up, but I remember from your opening mainly the point about the Finnish ice hockey thing, but I do believe you also said something around people in the audience here and out online, if you have thoughts, war stories on challenges you've had with having cross-border workers within the Nordics, and what would make it simpler, just ship them over to us. We can't promise that we'll change it, but at least we'll try.
Yeah, a good point.
But I think we'll wrap it up and thank you for us. And I believe I will have my dear colleague Lennart from Denmark get mic'd up and come up here to start the panel. And then we hope we have our panelists, Susanne from Volvo Cars, Louise from Lego Group, and Ryan from International SOS Online. But thank you.
Thank you.
For almost
Thank
7
you.
dwarfs.
Thank you.
You can mic me up.
I won't be the right person to mic you up. You will be mic'd up shortly.
Even better. Thank you. Welcome also from my side. Thank you for a great session, Paula and team. My name is Lennart Gilslut. I am a partner in Denmark. I am not from Denmark. I'm from Holland. I have worked in the UK, in the US, and in Switzerland before I moved to Denmark about 2 years ago. My wife is actually Danish. That's how I ended up in Denmark. You've heard from KPMG people. In the second session, which is around business travelers, we're not going to hear from KPMG people. In fact, we're going to hear from what the industry actually sees happening when it comes to business travelers. I won't have any slides. We're just going to fire off questions to the panelists, and I'll introduce them in a few minutes. But I first wanted to talk a little bit about my own reflection around business travel pre and post pandemic. And I thought about this on the plane today and consider myself quite a risk taker and had to face quite a few challenges. I had to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning. I haven't done that for a long, long time. So I'm a little bit low on sleep, which I believe is not so good for your health. I did not see my wife and my children this morning tonight, tomorrow morning. I might see them tomorrow evening, but it's not really good for the family well-being. Then I got to the airport, and I tell you, it is as if COVID never ever existed. We were standing like this, 30 centimeters from each other, queuing for 45 minutes to get through security. There is nothing like a 2-meter rule or a 1.5-meter rule. It doesn't exist anymore. Then I flew, which is not so good for the environment. And lastly, actually not lastly, I came to Finland, which is a beautiful country, first time in my life. But it does border with Russia, and there's a war going on, and I believe Russia is not so pleased with Finland for applying for NATO membership, which is a little bit of a concern to me when I came here. And then lastly, for the real core global mobility people, of course, I should have also thought about my A1 and PWD registration. So all in all, quite a few things to consider, and perhaps some of these factors I would not have considered before the pandemic as really being an issue, because I could have just stayed at home today and joined via Teams. The point is, business travel is back, and I will host a client panel discussion, and we're going to look at two things: business travel before the pandemic and after the pandemic. So we'll look a little bit about what employees' concerns are, how employers are responding to those needs, and are we considering different risks pre and post. And then we will look at, I think, a really interesting topic around how do you actually get your business case off the ground. And I think it's quite ironic that when people were not traveling, we saw a real uptake in RFPs for assistance to provide companies with identifying risk and mitigating the risk. And I think when we talk later on with International SOS, they probably saw the same. So how do you pack your business case in today's environment? How do you go about that, and who do you consult? And the great thing is that's where the sort of the interesting part comes. That's when we will listen to the Lego Group and Volvo Cars, as well as International SOS. I should say that for both the Lego Group as well as for Volvo Cars, they have put a process in place to manage business travel together with KPMG and International SOS. So this is my disclaimer. And we also have a strategic alliance with International S, which maybe explains why we're all on the same call. So Louise, Susanna and Ryan, could I ask you to please quickly introduce yourself in that order? So starting with Louise, tell a little bit about yourself, your company, and where you are when it comes to the journey that you're on to manage business travelers.
Yeah, thank you, Leonard. Yes, so I'm Louise Jusseson. I am from the Lego Group. Yeah, we started the journey actually many years ago, which is a bit funny because I think KPMG just kind of really got in touch with us a year ago. The whole idea of looking into business travel has been on the agenda for many years, but it was a bit intangible for everyone, and we didn't know how to start the journey. And somehow we kind of gathered a team that was able to kickstart the whole process. And funny enough, it fell together with COVID, and it left a bit of time, and it lowered the volume of business travels for us to actually look into our processes. So that's kind of how our journey started. Yeah.
Yes, okay. My name is Susanne Engström. I work as a process and policy owner with Volvo Cars and in the Global Mobility Group, and I'm based in Sweden. So we have been working also for quite some time to get attention regarding cross-border travel and the business compliance or travel compliance. But actually 2 weeks ago, we went live with a compliance solution, so we are really happy about that. So it's been an interesting journey, but we finally made it.
And hi, I'm Brian Copeland. I'm the Regional Medical Director for Assistance for Europe, Middle East and Africa for International SOS. My background is emergency medicine, but I've been working in this travel risk mitigation landscape for the last 14 years. We faced with two challenges. Number one, we have been delivering assistance support throughout the pandemic and have had to change and adapt as the virus has adapted and the shape of the pandemic has changed. But also we've been having to ensure business continuity for many of our services, which includes getting medical staff out onto remote sites. So we've been managing business travel throughout the pandemic and are now trying to help and support clients as business travel starts to pick up.
And I spoke to different people about how we were going to run the session. Everybody asked me to ask Louise and Susanna, what is your definition of a business traveler? So I just want to get that out of the way. Louise?
Actually, we do have a definition, but it's actually on the table to be redefined for multiple reasons. One of the reasons is that we are starting to implement the KPMG tool. We're very much in the beginning of the journey, but we are really starting to deep dive into our setup. And there's many reasons why we haven't determined it at this point in time. We also thought we had an idea of how we should define it. And then suddenly this whole new EU directive starting in August kind of threw everything in the air again, because we haven't determined anything, so we also could consider that along with it. There's also the factor that we're a bit unsure where to place the business travelers. I think that's a general problem in many organizations. So whether it should be like a fifth leg or so on global mobility, or whether it should be within corporate tax or travel, or where it should situate. And I think we're still in the initial phase of that. So very excited. That's definitely one of the things I'm hoping to take away from this call as well. Yeah.
Come back to you on that, because we were all hoping that you were going to answer that question for us, but we'll come back to that. Susanna, any thoughts on the definition of a business traveler in your organization?
Yeah, I'm afraid to make you disappointed, but we actually don't have an explicit definition either of a business traveler, but we do have a definition, what we consider a cross-border traveler, which is what we are focused on when we implemented this compliance technology. So I can fire that away if you want. So you are considered a cross-border traveler when you are employed and receive salary from a Volvo Cars in your home country, and your manager has requested that you cross a country border or a state border for work. This covers one-time, short, long, and frequent travelers, and regardless of whether you are crossing border by foot, car, public transport, boat, or flight. So there you go.
Coming back to Ryan quickly, just to bring COVID back in, are we post-pandemic, or do we still need to worry about COVID when it comes to business travel?
Well, certainly, if you look at it from a European perspective, it really does feel like we're post-pandemic. To your point around your experience at the airports, we know more and more countries are moving to an endemic position, which includes lifting of restrictions, entry requirements, reduced testing, as well as even lifting of legal requirements for self-isolation. So certainly, all of this is making the landscape much easier to navigate. And then if we look at it from a more global context, we're also fortunately in a much stronger position today, as we have higher rates of immunity, both from vaccination, but also from previous infection. And therefore, we have also lower disease severity, which we're seeing with the current variant lineage. And then lastly, the final weapon we have in our armory is the fact that we now also have oral medication available to treat high-risk patients early on in the disease. So all of these are contributing to what we see now, which is lower hospitalization rates and lower mortality, despite, let's face it, there's still some ongoing transmission. So certainly travel today is far easier and safer, which is all very positive, right? But we also need to remember that, unfortunately, the virus does not necessarily follow these well laid out plans. And the reality is we still will be facing a bit more unpredictability. And this is due to the fact that transmission is not necessarily stable, and the virus does mutate and will continue to change. And so we don't really know what it will do next. We also need to consider that up until now, transmissibility of the virus has been the main competitive advantage. And as we've also seen that there's been far more concerning variants that have been less transmissible, like what we had with Beta as an example. But these were simply outcompeted by these newer, highly transmissible variants like Delta and Omicron. But as we are now in a different environment where we have higher levels of immunity across the world, it might actually be the case that transmissibility may no longer be the main competitive advantage in the future, and immune escape might become a more favorable adaptive feature. And then just the last piece to consider is, we also see an ever increasing fatigue of both the public as well as government leaders, along with the very real risk of significantly diminishing funding. So as these emergency declarations continue to expire, we will have a reduced capability to detect new variants and control their spread. So whilst we're in a very different phase of the pandemic, we still face some uncertainty and exposure.
The point about the fatigue, I certainly noticed this morning, not only when we were queuing, but even just washing your hands before and after going on the plane. Thank you, Ryan. Susanne, could you comment if you have access to the data within Volvo Cars? Is travel back? Are your employees traveling again? Do you have a feeling for who's traveling and why?
Yeah, we are not back where we were before the pandemic, but we see that we are starting to travel a bit more. But we have set a goal within the company to reduce business travel by 35% per employee from 2018 to 2025. So before the manager approves a business trip, he or she should consider the whole picture, so like the purpose of the trip, the duration of the stay, and the time to travel, cost and convenience, for example. But where we see the trips are picking up the most is our expeditions that we really need to have in place to test drive our cars in different environments. So that is an important category of travel for us, and I guess that is where we will see the most increase.
Very interesting to hear about the reduction or the target reduction. Louise, I think you have something, you have similar objectives within the Lego group about the reduction in travel. That's one of my questions. And the other question is, are you considering additional factors as part of your approval process before you let employees travel?
So first of all, yes, we also are forced to reduce our travel emission. Actually by 50%, so quite significantly. But we have different, it's not like it's not allowed to travel. We've implemented, with COVID, we implemented an approval phase. So definitely seen a lot lower travel activity compared to 2019. It's a complete difference compared to then. And then we've implemented a part of a travel policy we call responsible travel, where we focus on when and how we travel. So if we're able to do our meetings virtually, or as you actually also mentioned, Leonard, taking the work-life balance into consideration, that's very much in line with the policies and the culture of the Lego Group, that you have the family in front of almost everything. It's also encouraged to combine your trips. It's also encouraged to choose other means of transportation than taking the airplanes. So there's different things that's put into place to lower the amount of business travels. Yeah.
Ask a question then on how that fits in towards the overall culture within the Lego Group, particularly when you talk about family and environment.
Well, the environment, we have a specific overall target to lower our emission. In that sense, it makes sense that just something that we're working towards. And then, as I mentioned before, work-life balance is a very, very important part of our business and culture. We are very much focused on family life and work-life balance. We have specific ways that we work. So we have a very big flexibility to ensure work-life balance, and that's really cherished. So keeping our our own life and that in focus rather than what benefits the company. But we also have certain activities where it's encouraged to go on a business trip, but it might be a bit different than from other companies. Like one of our main points is that if it's relationship building, teamwork and stuff like that, it's actually encouraged that we could turn up in person, and we ensure that we have a well-functioning team in place. Whereas other activities, sorry about this, Leonard, but stuff like this would actually be taking off the table because it can be done virtually, as you can see. So,
but I think
it's
you've just given me justification for being here in Helsinki.
Yeah.
That's good. Thank you, Louise. I want to bring back Ryan again. Two questions, I guess, Ryan, for you. First of all, a little bit about the demands from travelers. Have you seen the demand, or let's say it differently, the expectations from employees towards their employers change with regards to managing risks? And then secondly, more around general well-being and underlying health concerns. How does that factor into perhaps what Louise just mentioned about a responsible travel policy? Do you see more companies looking at that?
Yeah, thanks very much, Leonard. So firstly, from our own data, business travel started to make some early recovery back in August last year. Then that growth was immediately halted when Omicron hit in November. But actually, since February, we've seen a faster growth in the return to business travel with a 15% month-on-month increase. If we look at the current data, the number of business trips that we track are around 44% of pre-COVID levels. So we're still, quite far behind what we were in 2019. But what's interesting to note is actually the number of assistance cases we're opening have already far exceeded the pre-COVID levels, despite this continued reduction in business travel. And this is just down to the fact that the environment remains much more challenging and nuanced than it was pre-pandemic, and there's increased demand. And this is evidenced by the fact that from our own data, we've seen a 10-fold increase in the number of assistant cases per 100 business trips. So, we continue to see high demand for things like travel restriction-related queries, pre-travel risk assessments, both from a medical and a security viewpoint. And what's interesting is those risk assessments are for what we would call low-risk countries even, so travel within Europe. You mentioned your consideration around security, travel to Finland. We would never normally worry about that. But obviously, the landscape today is very different. And then we've also seen an increased demand for psychological support. But it's also down to the fact that even relatively straightforward arrangements, as an example, arranging an outpatient medical appointment, can actually still be sometimes challenging depending on the location. And the other very strong undertone is that there remains a heightened sense of anxiety for many when faced with the prospect of travel. And we're still seeing situations where travelers, may get stuck due to quarantine or pre-travel testing requirements that actually still remain in place in various parts of the world. So, the demand from traveling employees is certainly much higher today than it was in 2019. And then to answer your second question around from a service delivery perspective, we've therefore had to broaden the mental health services that we offer to have this as a fully embedded part of our workforce resilience product, offering direct access to psychological first aid and counseling. And this mental health resilience has been a very strong common theme for clients going through the RFP stage, during this period. And then lastly, we've also significantly expanded our consulting services in response to support clients with activities like COVID risk assessments, return to work policies, well-being programs, and then investment in digital solutions to manage the surge in demand related to travel restriction queries.
Very, very interesting. Can I bring back Susanna and Louise? What you just heard, do you recognize that internally, i.e. do you see different type of questions from either the employees or from the business, from HR, with regards to business travel? I know you got, Louise, you mentioned your policy, but do you receive different type of questions pre and post pandemic?
Definitely during COVID, there was definitely an increase on other topics that we normally would see among business travelers, and that was definitely the health part of it. Whether they were fit for traveling, and also the country combination with restrictions. In regards to restrictions, there was definitely a lot of questions on that. I haven't seen a lot since February, as you said, Ryan. It kind of eased out, and maybe because we have most of our population situated around Europe, I don't know. But it's kind of, COVID kind of died in February in Europe's terms and conditions. So we haven't seen anything since then. But it was definitely very much on the well-being of the travelers. Yes.
Thank you. Susanna, anything to add from your side?
No, I totally agree with Louise there. And I mean, the type of questions we had was a lot around the masks and the COVID tests and when to travel, where to travel, insurances, what they could have covered if something would happen. So, yeah, absolutely increased concern there from the health perspective.
Perfect. Thank you, Susanna. So we've looked at travel before the pandemic and after the pandemic. I think it's fair to say that some of the risk factors are assessed differently, or there are additional risk factors being considered. On the other hand, to some extent, we could argue things are back to normal a little bit, at least in Europe. Which then leads us to the second part of the discussion. How do you actually go about putting together a business case and getting this thing off the ground? Because one thing I guess we've noticed from our side, naturally the topic is not new. We've been talking about business travelers for many years, and yet most companies did not go ahead and implement a holistic solution, an end-to-end solution to manage the risks. Both of you now have, Louise and Susanna. So maybe first question for Susanna. I know you work with International SOS and with KPMG. Why do you outsource this, and which risks are you actually looking to manage?
Yeah, we are looking at it from two different perspectives. So we do have a cooperation with International SOS, as you mentioned, and there we monitor health and safety risks. So pre-travel, the employees can get travel advice depending on where the location of their trip. And we also track the business travelers during the business trip so that we can give them updates if something happens that they need to be aware of, if there's a change in the security situation where they are. And then on the other hand, we have this compliance tool now that we have implemented where we focus on the individual tax, social security, PVD registrations and immigration. So in that end, we are now we are now covering all the business travelers within the company to look at the compliance. So all these areas, they are related to the potential risk for the individual, and some are connected to the company. So we want to make sure that we manage them in as good way as possible.
Susanna. Louise, I wanted to bring you back. You talked about the timing of when you started your journey, which clearly was during the pandemic. And I just want to probe you one more time. Was there nothing more, no trigger point for the Lego Group that started that discussion? Was there anything in particular around the timing of you looking to go to market and look for a solution?
I would say there's more factors to it. I think it's been on the table a couple of times in the past. It's been a lot of the wolf is coming in regards to authorities, but felt it was dealt with properly in the past. Then, as any other major corporations, there are internal audits, and it was highlighted in an audit that maybe you should start thinking about stuff like this a bit more and a bit more structured. And then I kind of joined Global Mobility, and it was I do have experience from a different corporation where we worked heavily with business travelers. So I was kind of pulled in at the same time to kickstart this off. It took from when I started looking into it until we've had an agreement with KPMG, it took a year. So it takes a long time to get everyone to the table, make sure the right people are involved, and get it started. It's hard work, definitely.
Is that? And I promised both of you that I wasn't going to talk about corporate tax, but it's actually quite interesting. If you Google the Lego Group tax strategy, or if you Google Volvo Cars tax strategy, I think that's where you see the G in ESG coming in, and you can tie it back to business traveler compliance, because essentially it talks about tax planning and tax compliance, and that's Louise and Susanna's colleagues who are responsible for that. But there's a clear link, I think, between the documents that you can see online, because they're publicly available, and the journey that both companies are on. So quite interesting that if I think, for instance, at the Lego Group, you see the E represented, the S represented, and definitely also the G. Susanna, thinking back on your journey, where did the conversation start to put a framework, a policy, and a process around business traveler compliance?
Yeah, I mean, trying to convince the company that we needed to have something in place that started many years ago, but you could see in 2018 there was kind of more focus on it, partly because it was decided that global mobility would take the ownership of this area, the cross-border travel area, as we call it. Then when there was a function within the company owning this area, there was another sense of urgency to find a good solution to manage the compliance piece, and also then because of the proposition for the economic employer in Sweden, which gave more focus to it from the company side.
Would you say that was one of the key contributing trigger points for getting this off the ground, at least from the employment tax compliance perspective?
Yes, I would say so.
Okay, great.
So those two in combination, I think, was what kick-started everything for us.
Louise, you already touched on this a little bit, but for you, how did the conversation start, and which stakeholders did you bring in? And perhaps maybe you can even elaborate. We're going off script a little bit, Louise, but you did work for a different company where you had a program in place. What sort of experiences did you bring to the Lego Group in terms of what you'd set up within that company?
Yeah, definitely the importance of bringing corporate tax into the considerations. And that was my main focus, that I wanted to move a lot closer, like really, really increase the cooperation between global mobility and corporate tax. That was very much important for me, because I know that we could kind of answer those, 5-6 elements in that sense, immigration, PE, income tax, all those kind of things that normally is connected to business travel. So that was very much important. I also, at the point that I started, business travel was completely defined under the umbrella of corporate travel. So I also wanted to bring them in, of course, because they had definitely a high stake in this. So we consider it as a triangular thing. So we have, as part of our steer co, we have like heads of global mobility, heads of corporate tax, and heads of travel. So they sit as like a committee that kind of have an impact, all of them, on the project. And then we can bring other stakeholders in, but I didn't want to bring in too many either, because that is also a risk. And that was actually one of the reasons why it was postponed, because in the beginning, everyone has an opinion on business travel. That's just how it is. So I was trying to lower it and just make sure that I brought in the right people.
I have to say, I've witnessed it naturally, but your cooperation with Group Tax, Corporate Tax was very impressive, the way you run the process jointly, and I think that made the whole objective much clearer. But there were actually 2 points I wanted to follow up on then. And again, Louise, slightly off script. But one thing that I heard the Lego Group talk a lot about as part of this overall process is optimization. Do you have any thoughts on what you were looking for? Was it more closing the gaps between corporate tax and mobility? Was it on the data side? Was it on managing travel more holistically? And with that related, particularly when you worked with travel, did you have contrasting objectives as part of this project, or were you all sort of aligned, or did you come across something that actually caused some friction in terms of what they are responsible for versus what you're responsible for?
So this is not an ending discussions here. To be honest, it's an ongoing discussion. It's actually, just to be like really honest, we haven't defined where exactly the topic of business travel lies, whether it remains in travel or whether we put it elsewhere. That hasn't been determined. We all have the same shared goal, that we want to become more compliant. And when you say the word compliant, that just isn't the most sexy word in a company whatsoever. So people kind of move away, but it's still required that we ensure that we hire our we lowered our risk in when it came to business travel. So I would say it's it's a difficult, but it's a like a family thing. You know, you have to get together in the bus, but it does not always mean that you love each other to the end.
Well said. Just coming back to travel, did you have similar objectives, or were there points where you thought, and I'm particularly thinking here about the data feeds, right? Because we had a lot of discussions about the data they get from their travel provider and what we collectively need. Was that a seamless process or is that a seamless process to talk to each other and look at the solutions, or does it have any impact, for instance, on what they do, or perhaps the traveler in terms of the requirements gathering in order to do the risk assessments? Or is it perhaps too early to answer that question?
No, I can say a bit about it. It's difficult to, when it comes to data, it doesn't matter who delivers the data, it's always a bit difficult to deliver certain feeds and stuff like that. I think we really much respected each other and saying there are things that travel know a lot about, and there's things that we know a lot about. And travel definitely knows about ISOS and whatever feeds and information they can pull, whereas corporate tax and global mobility knows about compliance. So it's kind of a respected journey where we allow everyone to come with their inputs and give space for that. So a really good example is when we had to we hadn't in the past defined how we travel. So we didn't know, like, why are employees traveling? What are they doing when they're traveling? And when we kind of looked into that, a little scary thing was that we actually came up with exactly the same result of how we perceived our employees to travel. So I don't know if it's just a Lego group thing or whether it's just a good collaboration, but we somehow managed to agree on a lot of stuff. Yeah.
Very good, thank you, Louise. Wanted to bring back Ryan again. Ryan, you have different stakeholders, different buyers, effectively. What are the thoughts of your external stakeholders, and perhaps a secondary question around, do you have a feel for how they work with the other stakeholders within the company, and even on the budget side, do they have a different access to different budgets than perhaps what we see on the tax global mobility side, if you can answer it?
Yeah, thanks very much. So it's interesting to hear what Louise referenced. What we have found is, key stakeholder engagement has definitely changed because of the pandemic. Pre-COVID, typical owners used to sit in these siloed divisions. In a European context, this often was either security or travel, or sometimes a combination of the two. But the pandemic really has shifted this. Suddenly organizations went into crisis mode, and we were faced with these cross-functional teams that were stood up. The benefits that we're now seeing is that there's far better engagement across many functions, spread across HR, travel, security, sustainability, mobility, corporate tax, HSE, and well-being. And for us, this actually allows for an easier engagement, because the value proposition of a fully integrated travel risk and employee health and well-being program can actually be more clearly understood and therefore supported. Because each of these functions now understands the implication in terms of what they do. And what's most important is actually employee health and well-being should be seen as an important business continuity enabler. And, because this will not only maximize employees' productivity and engagement, but also become a lever for recruitment, retention, and ultimately provide a competitive advantage. So it's with this framework and this narrative that we're actually seeing more engagement with more functions, because ultimately organizations have to account for this increased remit and focus across all employees, both domestically and internationally.
Very interesting. I think it's interesting what you mentioned around budgets, perhaps securing budgets and putting that in the context of employee health. Louise mentioned that perhaps compliance isn't so sexy. We clearly think it's very sexy, and there should be a budget for that as well. But anyway, coming back to budget, Susanna, do you have or can you comment on who holds the budget within Volvo Cars for managing employment tax-related compliance risks?
Within HR, we have the budget for that. So we have had a lot of focus for the last few years on technical solutions. We have had a shortage of that within Volvo Cars. So that and the compliance area have been a great focus. So having a business case connected to that was kind of favoring in this this point we're at in the company at the moment.
And Susanna, one additional question on that. You mentioned that you have been activate, or you have been socializing the idea of putting a process around business travelers and managing that risk. You clearly now have secured the budget. In that lead up to securing the budget, have you had other requests made, and was that rejected? Do you have any views on that? Was it more difficult sort of before the pandemic than it was more recently?
No, I wouldn't say so. When we had the go-ahead or having global mobility managing this area, we had a go-ahead to employ one person 100% working in this specific cross-border travel area. And we have been also working, as Ryan mentioned, and Louise as well, that is very important with the collaboration between different areas in the company. So we have also worked very closely with group tax and other teams to build a really strong business case based on all focused area. So actually we haven't had any setbacks once this was launched. We had a go ahead, and it's been really going along smoothly, I would say.
Susanna, another question for you. When we prepared for this session, you talked about what we in KPMG call the silent running approach, right? So you collect all the data behind the scenes, the employee is kind of taken out of the process with regards to providing the data, etc. Was that a factor in you building the business case in order to convince other people that actually the disruption was limited when you roll out a program like this?
Yeah, it was very. We'll have a really strong focus also on user friendliness and user experience. So when we argued for this system that we chose with KPMG, then the silent running approach was really important for us. That we have a process already for booking business trips, and we didn't want to change that too much. So when we have the assessment made, it's made in the background based on data from that is typed in the travel management system when the traveler books the trip, and also it picks data from our HR system. So when the traveler is booking their trip, they get a question what activities they will perform during the trip, and that together with the rest of the data that is then picked up from the different systems, there is an assessment made in the background. So that has been the aim all from the beginning, and that is something that is very much supported from the company to not interfere with yet another system, another portal that they need to access.
And that's what we hear constantly on the market. I guess we hear about budget, we hear about the overall experience and the limited disruption to the employee, not passing on the burden to the employee. So we definitely recognize that. I have a few more questions for all of you. I'm conscious we only have 4 more minutes. On the previous session, we heard about working from anywhere, which is to some extent a whole different topic, and yet my bet is that it will land on your desk, Louise and Susanna. And my question is more around, is this a hot topic in your organization? And do you think that by virtue of having a business traveler process, this would be much easier to implement and probably also sit with global mobility for the same reasons that you probably will end up or do own business travelers. Maybe we start with Louise. Oh, then we start with Susanna.
Yes, yeah, we do have a policy in place that is covering remote work from another country. And that is on manager approval at the moment. So, but we are looking into having a different module connected to the one we implemented now that would also track these, because they're not tracked today at all. And also to make an assessment connected to those. So yes, I do believe that having the first module in place, that will absolutely help us with implementing the next step that would look into this work from abroad. Yeah.
Louise, we lost you, but you're back, thankfully. Did you hear the question, or should I repeat it?
Please repeat it.
My
Sorry,
my question was around bridging work from anywhere with business traveler. Is this a topic that is already live within the Lego group? And do you believe that having rolled out an end-to-end process, or being in the process of rolling that out for business travelers, will help you get onto the ladder, the journey for working from anywhere? Or remote working?
Oh, it's a tough one, because it's on the of what I'm allowed to tell you about. But I think our focus was definitely on business travelers. I know we do get a lot of requests on remote working and work from anywhere. But for us, it's really, really important that our employees are in our organization and comes to the office. So we have something called Best of Both, where we're supposed to be in our office a certain amount of days every week. And that doesn't necessarily go in line with remote working. So we are definitely in a challenging time, kind of sticking to our culture and how we believe we should work, because we do see a lot of requests for work from anywhere. And right now it's being denied. I don't know what the future would bring. I don't know what will happen. So I don't want to say, but at this point in time, this is the most important thing, is that we keep the culture alive, and we truly believe we do that best by having people coming into the office.
Clearly in the market too. Excuse me. One final question for Ryan. And I asked the last question already now to Louise and Susanna, so you can have a second to think about that. If there's one takeaway from you, one lesson learned that you can share with this audience about the overall process of getting your business case to implement a solution end to end, what would that be? And I'll give you a couple of seconds or minutes to think about it, because my question for Ryan is, what is the future of business travel from your perspective? Where is this gonna go? And will we face a period of stability, or do you foresee some changes in the way we approach business traveler at the moment and in the future?
Yeah, sure. So from a longer term perspective, the International Air Transport Association expects overall passenger numbers to only recover to pre-COVID levels in 2024. But between now and then, the issues that organizations face is, the travel industry was hit really hard by the pandemic. We're already seeing that the surge in demand that we're seeing with regards to increase in travel is not being able to be met by the lack of capacity of airlines and airports. And so therefore, from a short-term point of view, certainly over the next 6 months, and in particular over the peak European summer period, we should expect these challenges to continue. And we could even see a short-term worsening of the situation before things get better. But the other important factor, and this is where the organizational challenge comes, is the operating landscape will continue to become more complex. This is not the first time we've had a severe coronavirus. We've had SARS, we've had MERS, all in the last 20 years. We've had Zika, Ebola, and now obviously monkeypox. This is all part of the impact of the realities of climate change. And it's not just the medical risk that is changing. The influence of climate change on the security environment, increased civil unrest, food insecurity, cost of living inflation, are all making the volatility more challenging for organizations. And this is the landscape that we're going to need to view business travel moving forward.
Thank you very much, Ryan. Louise, have you thought about your final big tip for the audience?
Yeah, and there's many tips, but I definitely changes sometimes come from above, and definitely in our case it was because the VIPs in our organization kind of realized that we do need to put something in place. It also I would say that's kind of what helped this project to move along as well. And then it's all about having the knowledge to make it work, but not necessarily have the knowledge in-house.
Thank you. Susanna, same question for you.
Just wanted to quickly clarify also that we do not promote working from abroad. I don't want that to be understood in that way. We have a policy for it, but we don't promote it. So what I would stress then, I think, is to, for one, connect the values of the company very strongly to a business case to see what is it that matter the most. Like there's a very strong value for cars. For the individual when something goes wrong with immigration or tax or something else, and then also to connect the compliance risks with the real life scenarios to really make top management understand what we're talking about, to kind of make it more tangible, and as Louise mentioned, starting in the top management, it takes a lot of time to do this, so having the resources to really have a lot of stakeholders involved and reach out to starting at the top and going down.
That's really good advice. Thank you, Susanna. I see Paula next to me here, so that must mean it's the end of the session. I would really like to thank Louise, Susanna, and Ryan. I think it was really insightful from all three of you. Great contributions, and hopefully some real good takeaways for the audience. Thank you very much for giving up your time today. It is really very much appreciated, and we wish you well on your journey, and look forward to speaking to you again soon. And with that, I'll hand it over to Paula.
Hi, a big thank you from me to all of you there online on the panel as well. I would have loved to see you here in Helsinki, but maybe next time. But also a huge thank you for everyone who's been here in the room with us, everyone online. This day for me, and tomorrow as well, having all of my Nordic friends here is just a brilliant 2 days. And being able to share that with a huge group here in the room and online this year it's beyond words. I'm really happy to have you here. But with that, I think it's time to end our day. Luckily, it doesn't end with my Nordic friends. We'll continue for a while, today and tomorrow. And I guess I would ask all of you to stay tuned, because we will be sharing our thoughts on One Nordic approach to various themes over LinkedIn and here and there over the coming months. I've challenged a lot of people here to do some short videos, so I'm hoping to get a lot of likes for those when they come out. I did have a technical question for someone online who missed part of the first session, and that first part of the session we will be sharing on demand for anyone wanting to watch Fredrik, me, Håkan, Vladi and Timo talk. So let us know if that's something you want to rewatch later on. But with that, thank you to everyone. Thank you, Lennart, for hosting the panel. Thank you to my lovely co-speakers. And have a great day, everyone. Thanks.